I always thought I was good at hiding my emotions, at smiling through the heaviness in my chest and presenting a calm face to the world. People said I was unflappable, a stoic mother who took life's slings and arrows without complaint. But on that humid afternoon, beneath the faded sign of the school parking lot, I felt every nerve in my body snap to the surface. He was standing by the curb, leaning against the hood of his car, arms crossed, a faint sneer at the corner of his lips. He had one eyebrow raised, eyes flickering between me and his watch, a silent judgment that read clearly, "You're late. You're always late." And I could hear the unspoken condemnation. How dare I waste his precious time like that? How dare I, a woman who had once been a reluctant part of his life, remain entangled in such complicated ways? I gritted my teeth as I walked up, tried to force a pleasant expression for his child's sake. There was no point stirring the pot if I could help it, no point giving him more ammunition to deride me, but his words sliced the moment I approached. "Hate again, Jill? I guess that's all you know how to do. Keep people waiting and disappointed." His child Faith stood right beside him, clutching the straps of her backpack, eyes darting with uncertainty, caught in the middle of an adult war zone she never asked for. It was always the children who bore the brunt of our petty battles, and I hated myself for it. I wanted to scoop Faith into a hug to shield her from his venomous words, but the rules of our arrangement were so full of barbs and tangles that I hardly knew where to begin. I simply said, traffic was heavier than expected, but even to my own ears, it was a limp excuse, an excuse so many mothers and fathers used 1,000 times over. He let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head as if pitying me for my perpetual inability to manage my schedule. Maybe once I would have shrunk under that scorn. Maybe once I would have apologized or rushed forward with some desperate attempt at appeasement. But I'd grown in the shadows of resentment, anger, and the will to stand up for myself, so I refused to let him see my spirit crack. I inhaled and exhaled slowly, mustering a coolness I didn't quite feel. "We should get going," I said to Faith, not acknowledging his nasty little remark. The child gave me a timid nod, well aware of the tension between her father and me. He smirked. "Sure, you go ahead. I know you must have, oh, so important things to attend to. Always so busy, right?" He tossed the words in a condescending drawl, as though he'd memorized them to use at the slightest provocation. I almost walked away. I almost let it pass. But something in me snapped, the culmination of all the years and heartbreaks and humiliations. I pivoted just enough to lock eyes with him, letting him sense the shift in my mood. "Yes, I do have important things to attend to," I said, quiet but firm, like helping a little girl feel loved and safe, or dealing with a grown man who thinks he can bully me at every corner. He paused, perhaps not expecting me to respond directly. His mouth twitched, and for a second I saw a flash of genuine surprise. Then it was gone, replaced by the same belittling smile. "Bullying you? My dear Jill, you do that to yourself. If you can't manage your time or your obligations, that's not on me." Then he turned to Faith, placed a patronizing hand on her shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart. We've got to get home before your dinner gets cold." I remained silent, my heart pounding an unsteady rhythm. The air was thick with a tension that felt so familiar, like an old blanket that choked rather than comforted. By the time we were back in our separate cars, I was trembling. All the frustration welled up as tears threatened at the edge of my eyes, but I swallowed them down. I had endured worse. I had survived heartbreaks, infidelities, emotional manipulations, and quiet humiliations that gnawed at my self-esteem. That day, though, something in me realized that if I didn't stand up and fight, I would be trapped in this endless cycle forever. As I drove away, gazing at the rearview mirror, all I could see was my own reflection, eyes filled with a determined kind of sadness. It was the expression of someone tired of being on the receiving end of constant ridicule. I remembered how it felt to stand in the courthouse all those years ago, signing the final papers of a relationship that had been doomed long before we admitted it. In the swirl of those days, I told myself we'd find a workable civility for the sake of the child he had with another woman before me. the child I'd raised for a while as if she were my own, back when we were all still living under one roof, bound by illusions. Yet courtesy had never come easily for him, and I was too bruised back then to demand it. Now, though, I felt my heart pounding with a renewed sense of possibility. There's a limit to how much a single person can bear, how many subtle and not so subtle torments can be inflicted before something cracks. I was past that threshold, and I decided right then that I wouldn't keep subjecting myself to his verbal lashings without consequence. I may not have been Faith's biological mother, but I'd cared for her deeply once. I'd picked her up from school, packed her lunches, read her bedtime stories when her own father was too busy criticizing my every move. I wouldn't let his scorn overshadow what good remained in my connection to that innocent child. Yet the reality was that he held the official reins, the legitimate guardianship, even if I offered the day-to-day stability when it suited him. I was tired of tiptoeing, of making excuses and clinging to a vestige of normalcy that never existed. When I got home, I found myself pacing the living room, the worn carpet soft under my feet. The house was my fortress, albeit a modest one. The walls told stories of quiet nights alone and uncertain phone calls, of me reading documents until my eyes burned. The big bay window let in the golden light of late afternoon, and I watched neighbors pass by, a man walking his dog, a teenager on a skateboard, and a pair of older women power walking side by side. Normal life carried on, unburdened by the emotional chaos swirling inside my head. You can't keep letting him do this, I whispered to myself, a half-formed thought I'd repeated 1,000 times. But maybe for the first time I felt a conviction. Maybe I'd call an attorney, or at least insult one. Maybe I'd get rid of every email, every text message, every baseless allegation he'd thrown at me. Maybe I'd finally go on the offensive instead of always playing defense. But what would that look like? I stood in the middle of my living room, hugging my arms. I stared at the framed picture of me with Faith from a summer trip long ago, her little arms slung around my neck, her face flushed with laughter. Those were simpler days when she still believed family was forever and when I still believed that his cruelty was just a phase, a rough patch we could iron out. I reached for that frame, my fingers trembling as I lifted it. The memory was so vivid it made my chest ache. No matter what was happening between him and me, Faith deserved better than the venom that threatened to swallow us all. I refused to let her become collateral damage in a war she never started. Did I truly want a lawsuit? The mere word felt cold, brimming with legalities, financial strain, endless nights of anxiety. Yet the alternative? Allowing him to keep mocking me, keep undermining my worth and my credibility, was a slow, soul-sucking death. I'd endured it for too long. The question wasn't whether I wanted to, but whether I had any choice left. I sat at my small dining table, the one with a slight wobble on the left leg. I pulled out a pen and a notepad and started jotting down everything that came to mind. Incidents, times, dates. My handwriting grew messy as I recalled every verbal attack, every time he belittled me in front of Faith or others. A pattern emerged. He would lash out, then claim he was justified, citing imaginary flaws in my character or incompetent parenting. He used words like unfit, emotionally unstable, and ironically. And he always said it with that condescending little smirk. Each memory sparked an ember of anger in my chest, fueling a growing fire I had no intention of dousing. Hours might have passed. I lost track of time, only realizing how dark it had gotten when I glanced at the window and saw no trace of the sun. My phone buzzed. I jumped, the notepad tumbling from my hands. When I picked it up, I saw his name on the caller ID. My heart clenched. I wondered if I should answer. Common sense told me to let it go to voicemail, but some instinctive part of me needed to hear whatever cruel thing he had to say, to remind me of why I was doing this. I pressed the green icon. "Joe," he said, his voice a smooth drawl that made my skin crawl. "You forgot Faith's jacket in your car." I closed my eyes. He sounded too calm, like a predator purring before the strike. "I'll drop it off tomorrow," I said, forcing steadiness into my tone. She needs it for school, and since you weren't punctual enough to remember picking her up on time, I thought you might have the decency to return it promptly. So that was the reason he called. Another jab, another piece of blame. And I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. I'll return it, don't worry. He grunted. Try not to screw this up, Dill. The last thing Faith needs is another disappointment in her life. The line clicked dead before I could retort. My hand was shaking as I set the phone down. Disappointment. That single word lodged in my gut, swirling in a mix of shame and rage. But I knew better than to let it settle. And he wanted to provoke me. He was succeeding, but I wasn't going to stay silent this time. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner of leftover chicken and vegetables, though my appetite had vanished. I forced myself to eat, to keep up my strength, because the days ahead would likely test my limits in more ways than one. I felt a hollowness in my chest, a part of me mourning the peace we never had, the illusions we once clung to. I felt a hollowness in my chest, a part of me mourning the peace we never had, the illusions we once clung to. Yet amid that grief, a spark of determination flickered. I found myself recalling moments from our shared past, like the day he introduced me to Faith, a timid 6-year-old with big, curious eyes. I tried so hard to bond with her, to show her I wasn't a threat, but an addition to her small circle of caregivers. Her mother was absent in a way that no child should have to experience, and so I became the default stand-in, cooking her meals, helping her with homework. And all the while, he was the big personality, the man who commanded every room, overshadowing my quieter presence. At first, it felt comforting to be with someone so sure of himself, so decisive. I thought maybe his strength would bolster my own. But soon, that strength morphed into arrogance, and that decisiveness turned into control. How many times did he humiliate me in front of Faith, making little jokes about my clumsiness or telling me I should learn to dress better if I wanted to keep up appearances for his colleagues? Even then, I tried to rationalize it, telling myself he was stressed or dealing with a difficult job. The cruelty turned into a pattern so insidious that I hardly noticed how much of my self-worth it eroded. By the time I realized the toll it was taking, I was too entangled to easily walk away. But I did walk away, eventually. And that was when the real nightmare began. Our separation was complicated, full of accusations that turned every meeting into a battleground. I couldn't just disappear from Faith's life, and I didn't want to. She was too special, too innocent. I managed to stay present in her world by some tenuous arrangement that had no name, no official standing, just a handshake and a nod, which he wielded like a weapon whenever he felt like it. "Don't make me regret letting you see her," he'd say, as though it was an act of incredible generosity on his part. I grew used to the subtle ways he punished me. Late? He'd find a way to humiliate me. Busy with my own obligations, he'd question my loyalty to Faith. Tried to voice an opinion. He'd remind me that biologically, she wasn't mine. It stung, but I swallowed it because my bond with her mattered more than my pride. Until now. Now, I felt like everything was hitting a crescendo. The final straw was hearing that sneer, "Late again, Jill?" and the mocking in front of other parents, other children, as though I was some incompetent caretaker. That opened a floodgate of all the times I'd let him get away with far worse. All the times I'd apologized or slunk away, battered and ashamed. I was done. After dinner, I stood in front of the mirror, looking at the faint lines around my eyes, the subtle silver threads in my hair. Age had etched itself onto me, but I couldn't resent it. Each line, each subtle change told a story of endurance, of survival. I brushed my hand over my cheek, recalling how often he'd pointed out what he saw as flaws. In truth, these days, I embraced my reflection far more than I used to. If only I could apply that same acceptance to every facet of my life. The phone lay silent on the kitchen counter. Part of me wanted to throw it across the room. Instead, I grabbed it and scrolled through the contacts. I still had the number for an attorney I was consulted when we were unschooling our finances during the separation. Maybe it was time to make a formal stand. Something in me whispered that this was an extreme step, but I couldn't deny the logic. If I let him continue to demean me openly, with no repercussions, what would stop him from escalating? And if he escalated, how would that affect my small but meaningful connection to Faith? Shaking off the doubts, I typed out a message to that attorney. I'd like to schedule an appointment, possibly regarding a defamation or harassment suit. The words felt surreal, but a strange sense of calm trickled through me. I pressed send. Immediately, my mind raced with the possible repercussions. He'd be livid, of course. He might retaliate, might threaten to keep Faith away. But if I had a legal backbone, maybe I could force him to back off. He'd always counted on my docile nature, my reluctance to fight. It was time to show him that there were lines even I wouldn't let him cross. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I replayed every argument, every tear I'd shed in private. My chest felt tight with a mix of dread and anticipation. I couldn't predict the future, but at least I was making a move. The next day dawned gray and damp, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. I spent much of the morning tidying the house, the nervous ritual that helped me think. My attorney called back just after noon, setting an appointment for the following week. Enough time for me to gather my evidence, but not so much time that I'd lose momentum. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It was happening. I was stepping into a new territory where I wouldn't be the passive target. I tried to go about my day normally. Grocery shopping, laundry, small tasks that keep life going. Yet every so often I'd glance at my phone, half expecting a barrage of angry messages from him. But there was silence, and that silence felt ominous. Maybe he was biding his time. Or maybe he'd grown overconfident, believing I was just going to take his abuse as always. In the early evening, I remembered I still had Faith's jacket in the backseat of my car. It was a small pink hoodie with cartoon cats on it, one of those things little girls often adore. I touched the soft fabric and recalled the day we bought it together, at a discount store where she insisted on picking the one with the bright cats, even though she'd outgrow it in a year. A wave of affection washed over me. Despite all the pain he'd inflicted, the bond with Faith was genuine and separate from him. I vowed to protect that bond, no matter what. I sent a text. I can drop off Faith's jacket at your place this evening, around 7. Let me know if that works. 15 minutes later, he replied, fine. Leave it in the mailbox, don't bother knocking. So cold, so curt. My fist tightened on the steering wheel when I eventually drove over. His house was in a nicer part of town, a place with manicured lawns and symmetrical hedges. I hated how comfortable it looked from the outside, how it appeared so normal when I knew the darkness that lingered within. I left the jacket in the mailbox as instructed. I had no intention of seeing him if I didn't have to, but as I turned to leave, the door swung open. He was standing there with a phone in his hand, his face illuminated by the porch light that cast shadows across the yard. You could have told me you were here, he said, almost accusingly. You said leave it and go, I replied, trying to keep my voice even. Oh, so now you follow instructions. Good to know, he said, stepping closer. Are you just going to keep playing this game, Jill? My heart pounded. Game? Acting like some victim, throwing little tantrums when things don't go your way, showing up late then blaming me for calling you out on it. A pulse of anger shot through me. I'm not blaming you for anything that isn't your fault. He snorted. Right. Because you're always so innocent. My eyes flicked to the window, wondering if Faith was inside. Hearing this, "Keep your voice down," I said quietly. "Faith might hear." He rolled his eyes. "Faith is with a neighbor's daughter having dinner. Relax." Then his tone shifted, taking on that sneering edge. "Look, let's get one thing straight. You're an accessory in her life, not a necessity. If you keep making her life difficult with your unreliability, I'll have no choice but to cut you out entirely." I trembled, trying to keep my composure. "Don't threaten me with that." "Ah, I'm not threatening. I'm stating a fact." He took another step forward. I could smell his cologne, sharp and abrasive. "I've been generous letting you stay involved, but my patience has limits." I felt a bitter laugh bubble in my throat. "Generous?" The nerve. "I'm sure it took all your benevolence," I said, with voice tight. "But maybe you should consider the possibility that you can't lord Faith's affection over me forever. She'll grow up and see you for who you really are." Something flickered in his eyes, a flash of anger or maybe fear. Then he forced a laugh. "Go ahead, feed yourself that fantasy. But until then, you play by my rules or you get out of the sandbox." The weight of his words pressed on my chest, but I refused to let it break me. "In mind," I said, turning to walk away. "Don't walk away from me," he snapped, his voice rising. I paused, my back to him, heart hammering in my rib cage. "What do you want me to say?" I asked, my voice steady. "I'm sorry for being late." "Fine, I'm sorry, but I won't keep apologizing for existing." "Who said anything about your existence?" He scoffed. "But if you must apologize, do it right. Acknowledge that it was your fault, that you messed up, and you're going to try harder next time. I don't just brush it off with excuses about traffic." The gall of this man. In that moment, I felt a spark of defiance that overshadowed my fear. "I'm not here to beg for your understanding. You're here because you can't let go, Jill. You're attached to something that isn't yours anymore, if it ever was." That final statement cut deep, but also ignited a sense of clarity. I turned back, meeting his gaze one last time. "You're right," I said. "I am attached. But not to you, and certainly not to your condescending judgments. I'm attached to the little girl who deserves stability and love. Something you seem to know little about." Mm. He clenched his jaw. "Watch your mouth." "I'm done watching," I said, stepping away. "Now you get to see what happens when I stand up for myself." Then I got in my car and drove off, my heart pounding a fierce rhythm that resonated in my ears. Tears blurred my vision, but they were tears of a complicated mixture. Grief for the illusions lost, anger at the injustice, and a strange sense of empowerment. He had no idea what was coming. Over the next week, I compiled everything: text messages, voicemails, old emails where he had threatened to tarnish my reputation if I didn't comply with his demands. My attorney listened intently, asked probing questions, and when I explained the entire situation, they nodded gravely. "It sounds like you have grounds for a suit," they said. "Defamation might be tricky to prove, but the harassment, the emotional distress, there's a pattern here. We can certainly try." The word "try" hung in the air, heavy with implications. Legal battles are never guaranteed victories. But the simple act of gathering evidence, of acknowledging in a formal setting that his behavior was unacceptable, gave me a sense of vindication. For so long, I had let him define the narrative, casting me as the incompetent, scatterbrained caretaker. Now, I was taking charge of my own story. I left the attorney's office feeling lighter, yet also more aware of the road ahead. This would be no gentle walk in the park. He'd fight back, maybe even try to discredit me. But I wasn't going in unprepared. Day by day, I noticed changes in myself. I stood taller. My shoulders didn't slump as much. There was a new steadiness in my voice whenever I spoke to him on the phone to coordinate Faith's schedule. I suspect he sensed it too because he became oddly quiet, less verbally aggressive. Perhaps he assumed it was just another mood swing of mine, something that would pass. But one afternoon, my attorney sent the first official letter to his address, outlining our intent to seek legal remedies if he didn't cease his harassing behavior. By then, I was bracing for war. When the phone rang and I saw his number, my stomach twisted. But I answered. "What the hell is this?" he barked, not even bothering with the greeting. "You think you can sue me? For what?" His voice was loud enough that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. I'd expected as much, but the fury in his tone still rattled me. "I think the letter explained it," I said carefully, forcing my voice to remain calm. "You've repeatedly harassed me, smeared my name in front of neighbors, friends, and even in public spaces. You've threatened to cut off my contact with Faith without reasonable cause. It's enough." "You're insane," he hissed. "Insane. Do you think any court is going to take this seriously? You're just a bitter woman with too much time on her hands." The words stung like acid, but I ground my teeth, unsteadied myself. "That's for the court to decide." Silence on the line. Then he let out a mocking laugh. "Fine. You want to fight, Jill? You got it. And trust me, I'll make sure everyone sees you for the pathetic, desperate person you are." My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. "Keep talking," I said quietly. "Every word you say can and will be used as evidence." He hung up. I stared at the phone, my heart thumping so hard I thought it would bruise my ribs. My hand shook, and for a second, I questioned if I was doing the right thing. But I knew I couldn't turn back now. The days that followed were tense, as though the atmosphere itself braced for a confrontation. Mutual acquaintances started calling or texting. Some concerned, others nosy. He was apparently running his mouth, painting me as a scorned ex who was out for revenge, telling people I was trying to keep him away from Faith. The irony was staggering. I gritted my teeth through every conversation, calmly explaining that we had differentiation that needed legal clarification, but never stooping to his level of vitriol. It felt like a balancing act on a thin wire, suspended high above a swirling pit of gossip and judgment. Meanwhile, Faith seemed caught in the middle, though she never voiced it directly. I only saw her occasionally, under the watchful eyes of a neighbor or a nanny he hired. She seemed subdued, less talkative, and my heart ached. I wished I could reassure her that I wasn't going anywhere, that I wasn't attacking her father just for the sake of it. But how could I when she was so young, and when the lines of loyalty were so tangled? One evening, she managed to slip away from the nanny, who was occupied with something else, and she snuck into my car as I was about to leave. She hopped into the passenger seat, her eyes wide and serious. "You're not fighting with Daddy because of me, are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. My heart splintered. "Oh, honey, no," I said, turning to her, doing my best to keep it together. "This is between your dad and me. Grown-up stuff, I promise. You didn't do anything wrong." She bit her lip, tears glistening in her eyes. "He's really mad. He says you're trying to ruin his life." My throat felt tight. "I don't want to ruin anybody's life," I whispered. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree and we have to find ways to settle it. But I love you. That's not changing." Her little hand reached for mine, and I squeezed it gently. I wanted to tell her so much more, but I had to be careful. The nanny was probably looking for her, and I couldn't put Faith in a position where she'd have to lie. "You'll still come pick me up sometimes, right?" she asked, voice trembling. "I want that. I really do." I nodded, tears burning in my eyes. I promise. If it's in my power, I'll be there. She leaned forward, giving me a quick, desperate hug, then glanced back towards the house. I have to go, she said, sliding out of the seat. I'm sorry if I got you in trouble. You never get me in trouble, I tried to assure her, but she was already running back, small feet padding on the driveway. I watched her go, my heart an aching mass of love and sorrow. She deserved a stable environment, not this mess. That night, I stayed up late, going over the case details with my attorney by phone, recounting any new incidents. My voice shook at points, betraying how emotionally charged I was. But each time I felt my resolve waver, I recalled his sneer, the way he had publicly shamed me, the fear I saw in Faith's eyes. It strengthened my conviction to push forward. The tension escalated the following week when he filed a countersuit, claiming I was harassing him, that I was an unstable ex fixated on inserting myself into his family life. The legal documents were full of half-truths and outright lies, painting me as a resentful woman who had become unhinged after the dissolution of our relationship. Reading through them felt like wading through a swamp of indignation and disbelief. My attorney kept me grounded, reminding me that we had evidence to refute his claims, but it still cut deep. Seeing how easily he could twist reality, the man had a knack for bending narratives to his favor, and I knew he'd do anything to protect his image. Then came the day we finally stood in the courthouse hallway, waiting for a preliminary hearing. My stomach churned, and my hands felt clammy. I clutched my folder of documents like a life preserver. I saw him from a distance, talking animatedly with his own legal counsel. When our eyes met, his face hardened, lips curling in that infuriating smirk. Neither of us spoke. We just stared, two adversaries ready for a fight that was both legal and intensely personal. As we entered the courtroom, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, adding to the sterile tension of the place. The judge was a middle-aged woman with an air of no-nonsense practicality. She surveyed us both with a critical eye, then asked questions. Our attorneys each presented summaries of the case, while we remained silent unless addressed. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I feared I might stumble over my words if asked to speak. But I forced myself to remain composed, to not let him see the slightest tremor in my voice. The hearing ended with the judge requesting more detailed documentation, setting a timeline for further proceedings. Nothing was decided that day, but the seriousness was established. I felt a surge of relief and dread simultaneously. This was happening. No turning back now. Outside, I tried to leave quickly, not wanting any direct confrontation, but he followed me. When he caught up, he leaned in close enough for me to smell his aftershave. You really want to do this? He hissed. Dragging our dirty laundry in public? You think you'll come out looking like a saint? I could see the veins in his neck taut with anger. My heart pounded. A part of me wanted to scream at him, call him out on every lie he had just presented in there, but I swallowed it back. I just want you to leave me alone, I said in a measured tone. Stop lying. Stop harassing me. That's all. He snorted, You're delusional. But fine, if you want a war, you'll get one. Don't cry when it all blows up in your face. With that, he turned and strode away, leaving me shaking but oddly more determined than ever. As the weeks passed, depositions were scheduled. Each event chipped away at my nerves, yet also fueled a certain sense of purpose. My attorney dug into phone records, past testimonies, anything that could back up my claims. Simultaneously, I faced a barrage of discovery requests from his side, prying into my personal history, my finances, my social media posts. It felt invasive, but I pressed on. Late nights found me hunched over my laptop, answering endless questions, scanning old messages for anything relevant. Sometimes fatigue and self-doubt gnawed at me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, questioning whether I was strong enough to see this through. But every memory of his mockery, of his cruel words, bolstered me. I wasn't just fighting for me. I was fighting for that piece of self-respect I'd lost over the years and for the future interactions with faith, which I refused to let him tarnish further. Then came the depositions. I sat in a stuffy office under fluorescent lights as his attorney asked pointed, sometimes humiliating questions about my personal life, our relationship, my mental health, even my past relationships. Each question felt like a needle piercing my skin. But I answered truthfully, calmly, remembering that I had nothing to hide, that the worst they could do was try to twist my words. When my attorney cross-examined him, I saw him squirm for the first time. Under direct questioning, his confident facade cracked. His voice rose defensively, stumbling over details he'd lied about. Occasionally, his attorney would gently place a hand on his arm, trying to rein him in, but the stress was getting to him. He was so accustomed to controlling the narrative that he couldn't handle being cornered. A small, quiet part of me took grim satisfaction in seeing him sweat. For too long, he had reveled in my discomfort. Now, he was experiencing his own. The day dragged on, and by the end of it, I felt drained, emotionally and physically. Yet as I walked out, I felt a glimmer of hope. My attorney caught up with me, offering a small nod. "He's not as bulletproof as he thinks," they said in a low voice, offering me a reassurance I desperately needed. That night, I treated myself to a long bath, scented candles flickering around the edge of the tub. I closed my eyes, letting the warm water soothe the tension in my muscles. The bathroom was small, but it was my sanctuary for the moment, a space where I could breathe without fear of judgment. I sank deeper into the water, reflecting on how far I'd come from being that trembling woman who once apologized every time he glared. Things weren't perfect, and the legal battle might still take unexpected turns, but I was in it, wholeheartedly, not backing down. As the steam rose, I thought about Faith, her bright eyes, clouded with confusion lately. Was I hurting her by dragging this conflict out? Or was I showing her that it's okay to stand up to someone who bullies you, even if that someone holds power? I pushed the question aside, knowing I'd never have a simple answer. In the following days, rumors swirled. Small-town mentalities took hold. I got calls from acquaintances telling me that he was saying I was after money, that I was trying to blackmail him. Some people even asked if it was true, their tones dripping with concern or thinly veiled curiosity. I learned to respond succinctly. "We're dealing with it in court," refusing to be drawn into arguments. The wise ones left it at that. Others persisted, but I remained firm. It was an odd feeling to see my personal struggles become a piece of local gossip. Still, I pressed on, finding solace in small pleasures, reading a good novel before bed, going for brisk walks in the morning, chatting with a supportive friend who assured me I was doing the right thing. Each day, I grew more anchored in the knowledge that I was finally respecting my own dignity. Court dates came and went, each hearing or negotiation a step closer to a resolution. I tried to remain poised, letting my attorney do most of the talking. He was there, of course, glaring daggers across the table, occasionally throwing in sarcastic remarks. But the walls were closing in on him, and I could sense his frustration. Then, in a moment that felt surreal, we found ourselves nearing a potential settlement. His lawyer began to hint that maybe it was best to quietly resolve the matter, to avoid further public spectacle and legal expenses. My attorney relayed these offers to me carefully, ensuring we didn't give in to a deal that wouldn't genuinely protect me from further harassment. I was stunned that he might be ready to back down. Perhaps the weight of the evidence or the stress on his public image was getting to him. Or maybe he just didn't want to risk losing entirely. While a part of me wanted to drag him through a lengthy trial for all the pain he caused, another part of me yearned for peace. If I could secure a settlement that included a binding agreement for him to cease his harassment, and a stipulation ensuring I could maintain contact with Faith, maybe that was enough. My attorney was cautiously optimistic. I began to envision a life free from his constant belittling, free from the knot of anxiety in my stomach whenever I saw his name on my phone. I had a mental image of me at peace in my modest home, sipping coffee in the morning, not worrying about what cruel comment he might hurl next. The day we were supposed to finalize the terms of that settlement, I walked into the conference room with my attorney, feeling a jittery blend of hope and apprehension. He was already there, his lawyer by his side. As I took my seat, I noticed how weary he looked. Dark circles under his eyes, his posture less confident. Yet when our eyes met, he gave me a look filled with disdain. Old habits die hard, I thought. The lawyers went through the documents, discussing terms. I listened, my heart pounding every time they mentioned the clauses about defamation and harassment. Then something in his demeanor shifted. He interrupted his own attorney mid-sentence, slamming a hand on the table. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I'm not signing anything that makes me look like the bad guy." His lawyer tried to calm him. "We've discussed." "No," he growled, turning his glare on me. "You think you can corner me into this? You're the one who's going to regret it." I felt my stomach drop. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. "Sir," my attorney interjected, "if you continue this course, it will go to trial, and there's ample evidence." He pointed a finger at my attorney, spittle flying from his mouth. "Shut up. This is between her and me." Then he locked eyes with me, his voice dropping. "You really want to destroy me, Jill? Over what? Because you can't stand that I moved on? That faith is mine, not yours?" My throat tightened. I wanted to retort, to tell him it was his own actions that brought us here. But my attorney gently squeezed my arm. A silent caution. "I'm done here," he spat, grabbing his coat. He stormed out, leaving his flustered attorney apologizing and scrambling to gather paperwork. My attorney let out a heavy sigh once we were alone again, the tension dissipating into a cold emptiness. "We'll proceed," they said. "He's volatile. Eventually, he might realize this is his best chance to avoid a public trial." I nodded, feeling both numb and disappointed. I'd hoped for closure, for an end to this madness without further escalation. But it seemed he was incapable of swallowing his pride, even to protect his own interests. So the fight continued. Time blurred, each day a mixture of legal preparations, anxious waiting, and emotional exhaustion. But I never doubted the path I was on. Each mocking message he sent, each rumor he spread, became another brick in the fortification of my resolve. Finally, the trial date approached. By then, local gossip was ablaze. Some sided with him, some with me. Many just wanted a spectacle. But I tuned it out, focusing on the next step. Faith was at the forefront of my mind. How she might see all this, how it could affect her. But I also knew that showing her I could stand up for myself might teach her something about resilience. The court day arrived with ominous gray skies overhead. I dressed in conservative attire, my attorney by my side. The courtroom filled with murmurs, people settling into benches. He arrived wearing a sharp suit, but his face was drawn, eyes dark with anger. What followed was a whirlwind of testimonies, evidence, and legal arguments. My attorney methodically presented the numerous messages, the recorded phone calls, the accounts of him publicly mocking me. His attorney tried to paint me as vindictive, as hungry for attention or money, but the documented facts were undeniable. Each time they brought up something from my past to discredit me, my attorney countered with evidence that it was irrelevant or unsubstantiated. The tension was palpable. At one point, I had to take the stand and answer questions. My voice trembled initially, but I forced myself to speak clearly, to look directly at the jury and judge. I recounted how his harassment had impacted me, how I'd feared for my emotional well-being, how his intimidation tactics wore me down. I was careful to keep my tone factual rather than theatrical, mindful that the truth itself was powerful enough without embellishment. Then he took the stand. His testimony was a mix of bravado and victim playing. He claimed I was overly emotional, that I'd invented a narrative of abuse to gain sympathy. But each time he tried to twist the story, my attorney produced a contradictory text or email. I watched him squirm under cross-examination, his confidence cracking as the evidence stacked against him. Days of testimony stretched on, then both sides made closing arguments. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint. Yet, as we walked out on the final day of arguments, I felt a surge of calm. Whatever the outcome, I had told my truth. I had stood up for myself. The verdict came after deliberations that felt like an eternity. The courtroom was silent as the judge read out the findings. They found in my favor for harassment and emotional distress. The exact financial damages were modest, but the judge also issued a formal injunction, prohibiting him from any further harassing conduct. It was a resounding legal slap on the wrist for him, a declaration that his behavior was unacceptable. The moment I heard that decision, my chest constricted with a mix of relief and emotion so profound I had to hold back tears. I felt a swelling sense of vindication, not just for me, but for everyone who'd been on the receiving end of his scorn. He stood there, stiff, his face mottled with anger. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, as if to keep him from exploding. The judge warned him that any violation of the injunction would lead to contempt charges. Then, with a bang of the gavel, it was over. I exited into the hallway, feeling the weight of the tension drain from my limbs. My attorney smiled at me, shaking my hand firmly. "You exhibit," they said, a hint of pride in their voice. "You stood up and you won." I nodded, speechless, tears finally escaping in silent tracks down my cheeks. I could feel the stares of onlookers, but I didn't care. This was my moment of release. In the days that followed, I found myself readjusting to a life where I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder. He stayed silent, at least for a while, likely seething with resentment, but constrained by the court order. I began to sleep better, eat better, rediscover small joys like taking a walk at sunset or spending an afternoon reading in the park without the tight knot of stress in my gut. Faith remained an open question. I hadn't talked to her since the trial ended. I wondered how much she knew, how she was coping. Then one afternoon, I found a small envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a child's drawing, a woman standing with her arms open, a little girl running towards her. It was crudely drawn in crayons, but I recognized Faith's style immediately. Beneath it, in uneven handwriting, was a simple sentence. "I miss you." My throat tightened, tears springing to my eyes. I looked around the street, half expecting to see her or someone else, but it was empty. I pressed the picture to my chest, feeling a swell of love and heartbreak. No matter what legal battles had transpired, this child still cared, still reached out in her own innocent way. For a moment, I felt an urge to call him, to see if I could arrange a visit. But I remembered the boundaries. I needed to tread carefully. Instead, I wrote her a letter, full of warmth and reassurance, reminding her that I loved her. I tucked it in a bright envelope and quietly left it in the neighbor's mailbox, the one whose daughter Faith occasionally played with. I didn't sign my full name, just my initial, but I hoped she'd know. Maybe it was naive, maybe it was the only peaceful option I had. Weeks turned into months. Life settled into a new rhythm. I continued to be vigilant, mindful that a restraining order doesn't magically change a person's nature. But the relief was tangible, a lighter step in my gait, a gentler expression on my face when I looked in the mirror. I'd faced my tormentor and held him accountable. Whenever self-doubt returned, or whenever I second-guessed whether I'd done the right thing, I reminded myself of that day in the school parking lot, his contemptuous sneer as he ridiculed me for being late. That was the tip of an iceberg that had floated beneath our relationship for years, and I had finally broken it apart. Not by shouting or stooping to his level, but by using the law and my own unwavering determination. One evening, I received an unexpected call. It was a social worker representing a mediation program for parents and guardians. They explained that Faith had expressed a wish to remain connected with me. Could I attend a mediated discussion about establishing guidelines for visits? My heart surged. I agreed, cautious but hopeful. And so, in a small office with pastel walls decorated with children's art, I sat opposite him once again, this time at a table with a mediator present. He looked tired, subdued, but still carried an edge in his gaze. The mediator explained the purpose: to establish a structured plan for me to see Faith. Neither of us wanted to upset her life further. There was hesitancy on his part, some lingering resentment. But it seemed he finally recognized that fighting me at every turn was no longer viable. And so, grudgingly, we hammered out a schedule. I tried to keep the triumph out of my expression. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about doing right by that child. But inside, I felt a sense of victory nonetheless. He would no longer mock me publicly without fear of consequences. He would no longer hold Faith over me as a form of control. As we left that meeting, we passed each other in the hallway. For the first time in a long while, he didn't sneer or hurl an insult. He simply walked past, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on some point ahead. Maybe he'd never change at his core, but he'd been forced to respect the boundaries I'd set through the legal system. That alone was a monumental shift. In the car, I sat in silence for several minutes, letting the reality settle in. I thought back to that pivotal moment. He mocked me for picking up his kid late, so I let him pick up the lawsuit. It sounded almost glib now, like a tagline from some dramatic story. But the truth was, it represented so much more than a single event. It was the culmination of years of silent suffering, suddenly erupting into a fierce stand for my own dignity. I breathed in, slow and steady, letting the tension flow out with each exhale. In the months to come, I knew we would still have challenges. Coexisting in Faith's life would require restraint and civility. But I also knew that I had rediscovered a part of myself I thought I'd lost, the part that believed in my own worth. I started the car, feeling a gentle flutter in my chest that I recognized as hope. It wasn't just about a legal victory, it was about the quiet revolution that had happened inside me. I drove home under a sky tinged with the glow of dusk, reminded of how quickly light fades, but also how it returns, day after day. I parked in front of my house, stepping out onto the cracked driveway. The soft breeze brushed against my hair, and for the first time in a very long while, I smiled, fully, genuinely, without the weight of shame or fear. I walked to my front door, keys jingling in my hand. In that moment, I felt a surge of gratitude for every challenge that had led me to stand up and say, enough. Maybe I wasn't perfect, maybe I had my own flaws, but I was no longer the punching bag for his insecurities. That single thought was worth all the sleepless nights, the courtroom anxiety, and the invasive legal scrutiny. And so, in the quiet of my home, I brewed myself a cup of tea, a small ritual that symbolized comfort and renewal. As the steam curled upwards, I closed my eyes and felt the tender glow of a future that no longer seemed quite so suffocating. I remembered the day I let him pick up that lawsuit, and I realized it was the day I truly began to pick up the pieces of myself. And with each new sunrise, with each small act of self-care or time spent with people who valued me, I stitched those pieces back together, forming something stronger and more resolute than before. I had stepped away from his shadow, and it no longer defined me. Now I lived in the light of my own volition, no longer late to my own sense of self-worth. And that, above everything else, was the sweetest victory I could claim.